The conference hall in Washington, D.C., was supposed to be a polite arena of diplomacy, but the moment Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped inside, the air changed. American officials straightened their backs. Lobbyists whispered behind folders. Cameras shifted instantly toward him, as if the room had just acquired a gravitational center. Traoré walked with the calm confidence of someone who didn't need permission to exist, a man who had survived coups, sanctions, threats, and foreign pressure without bending an inch. And America felt that energy the moment he entered. At the far end of the hall, Pam Bondi watched him with narrowed eyes. To her, African leaders were supposed to be predictable, grateful, intimidated. But Traoré wasn't any of those things. He didn't smile politely. He didn't lower his gaze. He didn't play the game. And that terrified her more than she would ever admit. When Traoré took his seat at the round table, Bondi leaned forward, voice slicing through the murmurs. "You're out of line," she snapped, loud enough for every diplomat to hear. Her words echoed across the room, sharp, accusatory, dripping with authority that she assumed still meant something. Traoré didn't blink. He simply lifted his eyes, looked directly at her, and answered with a steady, controlled voice that somehow landed harder than a shout. "No, Ms. Bondi," he said. "Your line ends here." The room froze. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, precise, with the weight of a continent behind him. A few diplomats shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they were checking their notes. Even Bondi felt a flicker of uncertainty. But pride pushed her forward. "You don't get to challenge American authority," she hissed. "You don't get to walk in here and act like you're our equal." Traoré leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "I didn't walk in here as your equal," he replied. "I walked in as your reminder." Bondi frowned. "Reminder of what?" "That Africa no longer kneels." A murmur spread through the hall like electricity. Reporters raised their cameras. Diplomats held their breath. Traoré wasn't here to debate. He was here to confront a mindset older than the building they were standing in. Bondi tried to regain control. "You're being reckless, defiant, disrespectful, and you," Traoré said quietly, "are being outdated." Bondi's jaw tightened. "You think you can speak to us like that?" Traoré didn't break eye contact. "I speak the way truth requires." For a moment, the room felt too small for the two of them. Two different worlds. Two different histories. One undeniable clash. Then Traoré pushed his chair back slightly, placed his hands on the table, and said in a voice that would be replayed across social media for days. "I'm not here to fit into the order you built, Ms. Bondi. I'm here to expose it." The hall erupted, some in shock, others in admiration, others in fear of what would come next. The tension thickened as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Pam Bondi recoiled slightly, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. No one, especially not on American soil, had ever spoken to her like that. Her face stiffened, the politically trained smile fading from her lips as she straightened in her chair. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, her voice low, tight. "Leaders who challenge us don't last long." Traoré's expression didn't shift, not even a twitch. Instead, he studied Bondi as though she were a relic of a world he had already buried. "The leaders who bowed to you didn't last either," he replied. "History erased them, not Africa." A ripple spread across the table. Some officials looked down, suddenly fascinated by their pens. Others stared at Bondi, waiting for her to explode. But she didn't, not yet. Her pride was wounded, but she didn't want to look rattled. She leaned in. "You talk like you represent a superpower," she said. "But you lead a small country with limited influence." Traoré didn't even blink. "A small country," he said, "that refuses to be controlled is bigger than an empire built on intimidation." Bondi clenched her jaw. "You think you intimidate us?" "No," Traoré said. "I think the truth does." The words hit harder than Bondi expected. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker across her face. Her irritation. Her disbelief. Her growing anxiety that she was losing control of the narrative, and the room. Bondi forced a laugh, thin and strained. "So what exactly are you accusing the United States of?" Traoré leaned forward, fingers intertwined, elbows on the table. I don't accuse, he said quietly. I expose. And what will you expose? She challenged. Traoré didn't hesitate. That your order is just another name for pressure. That your freedom is a leash. And that Africa has cut it. A hush swept across the hall. Even those who disagreed with him were forced into silence by the weight of his words. Bondi's eyes widened, not expecting him to strike so directly. You're out of your depth, she whispered sharply. Traoré's reply was instant, steady, sharp as a blade. Or maybe you're drowning in yours. Bondi's hands tightened around her pen, knuckles whitening. The cameras recorded everything, her anger, his composure, and everyone in the room knew, Traoré wasn't backing down. Not today. Not ever. Pam Bondi finally lost the last thread of her patience. She slammed her hand on the table. Hard enough to send a brief echo through the room. Cameras jerked toward her instantly. Traoré did not even flinch. Let me make something clear, Bondi hissed. America sets the standards. America draws the lines. And America decides who crosses them. Traoré tilted his head, almost amused. Then America should draw straighter lines, he said calmly. Because yours only point back to you. A handful of reporters hid their smiles behind their notepads. Others stared wide-eyed, sensing the moment turning historic, viral, unavoidable. Bondi, already red with anger, leaned across the table. You're provoking us, she whispered sharply. And that has consequences. Traoré leaned in too, just enough so only the microphones could catch it. And you're used to people being afraid of those consequences. Bondi pulled back as though he had caught her secret and held it up for the world to see. Her silence lasted 2 seconds too long, and in political combat, 2 seconds was a lifetime. You think this is a game of bravery? She snapped. No, Traoré replied. It's a test of integrity. And you're failing in real time. Bondi opened her mouth to fire back, but Traoré continued before she could form a word. You came here expecting to intimidate a soldier, he said. You forgot soldiers don't scare. The pause that followed froze the entire hall. Bondi blinked, trying to regain control. This isn't war, she said, voice trembling slightly. This is diplomacy. Traoré smiled, slow, steady, devastating. Diplomacy, he repeated. Then why do your threats sound like ultimatums? Bondi swallowed hard, suddenly aware of every camera trained on her. Her image mattered, her posture mattered, and Traoré was dismantling it piece by piece. You're twisting my words, she said, struggling for composure. No, Traoré answered, I'm revealing their shape. Bondi turned to the other officials for support, but none stepped in. Not one. Everyone had sensed the shift. Traoré wasn't the visitor in that room, he was the gravity pulling it all into orbit. As the silence stretched, Bondi realized something she had never admitted aloud. She wasn't controlling this encounter. Traoré was. Say what you want, she muttered finally, but you'll regret challenging us. Traoré leaned back in his chair, completely unshaken. I don't regret challenging empires, he said softly. Only letting them believe they still rule. The room erupted with clicks as reporters captured the moment, a turning point no one would forget. Pam Bondi grew louder the more cornered she felt. It was almost scientific. The weaker her argument became, the more her voice tried to compensate. Cameras zoomed in on her trembling jaw, capturing every flicker of frustration as if the world needed a close-up of her unraveling. Leaders like you always end the same way, she barked. We invite you to the table, and you end up crushed under it. Traoré didn't even wait for her to finish. That's your problem, he said calmly. You still think you own the table. Bondi blinked, stunned. Is that a threat? No, Traoré replied. It's reality. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The air grew heavier, the lights harsher, the silence thicker. Something in Traoré's tone made it clear, this wasn't bravado. This was a warning rooted in absolute conviction. Bondi tried to recover by raising her voice even further. We stop chaos. You create chaos, Traoré said. We clean up the consequences. Bondi let out a forced laugh, a thin, brittle sound hiding panic. And who are you to lecture us? Traoré slowly stood up from his seat. The motion alone was enough to silence half the room. He didn't need to yell. His presence did the speaking. "I'm not lecturing you," he said. "I'm reminding you of something you forgot. The voice of the people is louder than the voice of politicians." Bondi rose to her feet, face flushed with anger. "You don't get to question my country's decisions." Traoré's smile was almost imperceptible. "If your decisions harm my people," he said softly, "then yes. I question everything." Silence. Heavy, crushing silence. Even Bondi's aides stopped breathing. "You're out of line," she hissed. Traoré tilted his head slightly. "I know exactly where my line is," he said. "Yours ends today." The sentence hit her like a slap, sharp, humiliating, public. In that moment, every person watching understood who carried the power in that room. And it wasn't Pam Bondi. Pam Bondi stood frozen for a moment, stunned by Traoré's quiet but crushing reply. She wasn't used to being confronted. Especially not by someone who refused to be intimidated by her title, her political weight, or her carefully cultivated public persona. Her authority was built on theatrics, Traoré's was built on conviction. Across the room, diplomats whispered among themselves, trying, and failing, to pretend they weren't witnessing something historic. Cameras tilted, journalists leaned forward, and even the security guards subtly shifted to get a better view. Everyone sensed it, the stage had shifted. The balance of the room had flipped. Bondi took a deep breath, attempting to regain control. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she spat. Traoré didn't blink. "I'm talking to you exactly as you talk to everyone else." Her eyes narrowed. "We protect democracy. You export control," Traoré answered. "There's a difference." The line cut through the room like a blade. A diplomat in the back audibly gasped. Bondi stepped closer, lowering her voice but sharpening her tone. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Traoré." He leaned slightly toward her. "The dangerous game," he replied, "is believing the world still bows to you." Bondi's face flushed. The insult wasn't loud, but it was devastating. "You're making a mistake." Traoré raised an eyebrow. The mistake was assuming Africa would remain silent forever. Bondi pointed a finger at him, a sign she'd lost the last shred of composure. "We can isolate you. Politically. Economically. Militarily." The corner of Traoré's mouth lifted. "You tried that for 60 years, look how that turned out." Whispers erupted. Bondi's hand trembled slightly, she hid it behind a folder. "You're provoking us," she said. "No," Traoré replied calmly. "I'm exposing you." Bondi took one more step, too close, too emotional. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not." Traoré spoke softly, yet every word carried the weight of a continent. "Touch me," he said, "and you touch millions." Good luck surviving that storm. A shiver ran through the room. Even Bondi took half a step back. For the first time in her political career, Pam Bondi looked like someone who had finally met a wall she couldn't shout through. Pam Bondi tried to stand taller, but the room had already shifted away from her. It was as if the energy itself had chosen a side, and it wasn't hers. The officials seated behind her exchanged uneasy glances. Her staff avoided eye contact. Even the cameras seemed less interested in her and more locked onto Traoré, who stood calm, steady, unbothered. Desperation seeped into Bondi's voice. "You're undermining the entire international order with this attitude." Traoré tilted his head slightly. "If your order requires silence, obedience, and suffering," he replied, "then maybe it deserves to be undermined." Bondi slammed her hand onto the table. "You don't get to decide that." Traoré didn't flinch. Not even a blink. "I don't," he said. "The people do." She scoffed loudly, trying to dismiss him. "Your people don't understand global politics. They understand exploitation," he answered. "Better than you think." Bondi's jaw clenched. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was rattled. It was visible. Her rhetoric, once powerful in American media circuits, suddenly felt flimsy in front of a leader who didn't operate inside her playbook. Someone in the audience whispered, He's not scared of her at all. And he wasn't. Bondi raised a stack of papers, waving them dramatically. Your so-called reforms are dangerous. Radical. Unstable. Traoré nodded. Freedom usually looks radical to the ones who benefit from the chains. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Bondi finally tried a different tactic, softening her voice, placing a hand over her heart, fake sincerity dripping like syrup. I'm trying to help you, she said. We're trying to guide you. Traoré gave her a long, piercing look. If this is guidance, he said, Africa has survived worse. Her mask cracked again. You're acting like a hero, Bondi hissed. I'm acting like a leader, Traoré corrected. There's a difference. She took a step forward, voice trembling as she attempted one last rhetorical strike. You're playing with fire. One wrong move, and you'll burn everything you built. Traoré lifted his chin. If fire is needed to melt the old chains, he said. Then let it burn. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in a stunned silence so loud it felt like a roar. Every diplomat, aide, journalist, and observer knew, another line had been crossed. A new phase of the confrontation had begun. Pam Bondi had insulted him. Traoré had dismantled her. And the world had just witnessed the turning point. Pam Bondi's composure was gone. She kept adjusting her jacket, clearing her throat, tapping her pen, anything to hide the fact that her confidence had evaporated. Her political instincts told her she was losing control of the narrative, losing the room, losing the fight. And worst of all, she was losing to someone who didn't even need to raise his voice. She leaned forward aggressively. You want to shame us on the world stage? Fine. But let's talk about your leadership. Your country struggles economically. Your region is unstable. And you stand here pretending you're some global force? Traoré didn't react, not a twitch, not a breath out of rhythm. Pretending, he said calmly. No. Becoming. Bondi rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh please. But Traoré cut her off with a single gesture, as subtle as it was commanding. You think power is measured by GDP, military bases, or donations? He asked. Power is measured by the people who believe in you enough to rise with you. Bondi's mouth tightened. She hated that answer because she couldn't counter it. Numbers were her shield, human conviction was not. We uplift entire nations with our aid, she fired back. You control them with it, Traoré replied. The audience murmured again. Bondi felt trapped, like every angle she took only led her deeper into a corner. You're twisting everything, she snapped. We protect global stability. Stability for who? Traoré asked. For the people under the table, or the ones sitting on top? The question struck like a hammer. Even the translators paused for half a second, stunned by the clarity of the blow. Bondi pointed at him again. You're accusing us of oppression? Traoré shrugged lightly. If you're offended by the accusation, maybe examine why. Her face reddened instantly. This is why leaders like you fail, Bondi hissed. You care too much about pride and not enough about alliances. Traoré smiled faintly. Alliances built on fear aren't alliances. They're threats with handshakes. Bondi froze, just for a moment, but long enough for every camera in the room to capture it. You're naive, she said weakly. You'll learn. No, Traoré replied. You'll learn that a voice backed by millions is louder than an empire backed by ego. Bondi's lips parted, but nothing came out. The entire hall felt it. Pam Bondi had just been verbally outmaneuvered, outclassed, and outshined, again. And the world wasn't watching her anymore. The world was watching Traoré rise. The tension in the hall grew thicker, almost physical, as if the air itself understood it was witnessing a turning point. Pam Bondi tried to regroup, tried to recover the authority slipping from her fingers like sand. She straightened her back, forced her voice to steady, and attempted one last offensive. "You stand here criticizing American policies," she said, "yet your own nation depends on global support. Without the West, half of Africa would collapse." A few delegates shifted uncomfortably. It was the kind of statement only someone who misunderstood the moment would dare to say. It wasn't confidence, it was desperation wearing confidence's clothes. Traoré tilted his head slightly, studying her. Not with anger, but with the kind of calm pity reserved for someone who doesn't realize the ground beneath them is crumbling. "Collapse?" he repeated softly. "No, Madame Bondi. Africa isn't collapsing. It's waking up." The sentence rolled through the chamber like thunder. Bondi scoffed loudly. "Waking up? To what? Chaos? Regimes like yours destabilize regions." Traoré didn't even blink. When the colonizer calls independence a chaos, it says more about the colonizer than the independent. Gasps. Cameras zoomed in. The translators looked at each other, as if confirming they had heard correctly. Bondi shook her head. This is exactly why no one takes you seriously. You throw around big words and dramatic lines. But who are you really threatening? Threatening? Traoré repeated again, this time with a smile that sent a chill through the room. "Madame Bondi, truth isn't a threat unless you're guilty." Bondi swallowed hard. But Traoré wasn't done. "You claim to defend freedom," he continued. "Yet every time a nation chooses not to bow, you label them rogue. Every time we step out of the shadow, you panic." Bondi slammed her papers on the desk. "We don't panic." "You are panicking right now," Traoré answered simply. The room erupted, some stifling laughter, others whispering in disbelief. Bondi's cheeks flared a deep red. "You think this makes you powerful?" she said through clenched teeth. "No," Traoré replied. "It makes me honest. Power comes from the people who stand with you, not the ones who fear you." Bondi leaned in across the table. "You're going to regret speaking to us this way." Traoré's expression didn't change. "No. What I regret is that for decades, Africa whispered while the world shouted. Now the roles are changing. And you're not ready for that." The sentence hit Bondi harder than any insult could. Traoré sat back, perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. A man who understood his words were no longer just an argument, but a declaration. Across the hall, delegates from multiple nations nodded subtly. Some even smiled. A shift was happening right in front of her, and she was powerless to stop it. The world wasn't laughing at Traoré. The world was laughing at her. Pam Bondi's composure was gone. Completely shattered. She had come expecting a symbolic confrontation, something easy to dismiss. A young African president she believed she could out-talk, outstage, overpower. But instead, she found herself drowning in a battle she thought she controlled. She leaned back in her chair now, trying to steady her breathing, trying to salvage dignity from the wreckage Traoré had created. Cameras captured every twitch of frustration on her face. Millions were already clipping the moment, replaying it, laughing at her trembling lips. Traoré, meanwhile, looked as if he had just started warming up. "Let me remind you of something," Bondi said suddenly, forcing a smile that fooled no one. "You don't speak for Africa. You don't represent anyone but your own regime." Traoré raised a brow. "Is that so?" "Yes," she said. "Africa is full of responsible leaders who respect alliances, who appreciate America's guidance. You're an outlier." Traoré didn't respond immediately. He just looked around the room, directly at the African delegates. Ghana, Senegal, Namibia, Mali, Somalia, Tanzania. Many of them met his gaze, and nodded. A silent message. He did represent them, maybe more than Bondi realized. Traoré finally spoke, voice deep, steady, cutting through the hull. Madam Bondi, the problem is not that I speak for Africa. The problem is that, for the first time in your life, you're hearing Africa speak. The hall trembled. Bondi looked around quickly, expecting support. There was none. The African representatives avoided eye contact with her. Some leaned forward, listening. Others folded their hands, faces unreadable, but certainly not with her. Traoré kept going. You keep insisting I'm out of line, he said. Yet every time Africa demands respect, you draw the line yourself. A line meant to keep us beneath you. Bondi broke. That's not true. It is, Traoré replied. And deep down, you know it. He leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, but undeniably dominant. You talk about alliances. But alliances built on fear are not alliances, they're cages. Bondi froze. And maybe, Traoré added, that is why you are so defensive today. Because the cage door is finally open, and Africa is stepping out. A wave of whispers swept across the chamber. Cameras zoomed in even closer. The moment was electric, historic, and unmistakable. Pam Bondi tried to play one last card. If Africa steps out, she said stiffly, don't expect us to protect you. Traoré exhaled through a soft, almost amused smile. Protect us? No, Madam Bondi. Africa isn't looking for protection. He paused, letting the silence sharpen the moment. Africa is preparing to protect itself. Bondi's eyes widened. It was the first time fear, not anger, flashed across her face. And the whole world saw it. The hall felt different now, charged, heavier, as if every word spoken had rearranged the balance of power inside it. Pam Bondi looked smaller in her chair, her voice buried somewhere beneath her frustration. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré stood calm, shoulders squared, every inch of him radiating the confidence of a leader who knew he had not just won an argument, but shifted a global narrative. Bondi tried one last attempt to salvage her authority. You may fool people here with theatrics, she said, lifting her chin. But when this meeting ends, the world will still follow America's lead. You can't change that. Traoré stepped forward. Not rushed, not loud, but with the deliberate assurance of a man who no longer needed to raise his voice to command a room. Madam Bondi, he said, the world followed America because Africa was silent. Not because America was right. Bondi flinched. He continued. You mistake volume for power. But history remembers truth, not noise. A few delegates murmured in agreement. Cameras clicked. Bondi tightened her jaw, fingers gripping the table as if holding on to the last remaining piece of control. Traoré didn't stop. For decades, Africa's resources built empires far from our shores, he said. Our gold, our oil, our labor fed nations that called themselves civilized while draining the life out of ours. Bondi tried to interject, but Traoré raised a hand, not rudely, but firmly, as if placing a boundary she had never been denied before. And every time we questioned this, he said, we were told to stay in line. To be patient. To be grateful. Bondi's breathing quickened. The cameras were merciless now, zoomed in on her shaking expression. Traoré leaned in slightly. Your line, he said softly, ends today. Silence. Total silence, no whispers, no shifting chairs, not even a cough. Bondi looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would intervene, defend her, offer a lifeline. No one did. Traoré then turned to the entire hall. Africa will no longer negotiate its dignity, he declared. We will build alliances based on equality, not intimidation. Partnerships based on respect, not dependency. A ripple of applause began, first from African delegates, then others joined. The sound grew, expanding like a wave across the chamber. Bondi's face drained of color. Traoré delivered the final blow. You claimed I was out of line. But maybe the real problem is that, for the first time, you're no longer standing above one. Bondi had no answer. Not a word. Not even a breath. As the applause thundered, Traoré stepped back, perfectly composed. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply stood with the quiet strength of a man who knew history had just shifted a few inches in his direction. And the world saw exactly who stepped forward. And who stepped back.